It's incredible that Mike Lynch's widow, the owner of the Bayesian, was lying in bed with him on the night going into the morning of the incident, and yet she survived and he didn't. I'm not sure what I was thinking, that did he party later than she did, came to bed earlier, or she couldn't sleep or something, but it turns out they were actually lying in bed together. She woke up and then got up to make sure what was going on. Angela Baccares and Mike Lynch provide yet another analogy to the Robert Baden-Powell and the Bayesian. Why does one survive and yet not the other? Now, in the aftermath of the tragedy, Ms. Baccares reportedly told doctors that the boat had tilted, waking her and her husband, and that is according to the Telegraph. One has the impression he wakes up but stays in bed, something that turns out to be a fatal decision, while she gets up and lives to fight another day.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, there's no court day or no public hearing with the US Coast Guard, and so we are going to look at some of the latest news with regard to the superyacht. According to Italian newspaper La Repubblica, Angela Baccares said that she had climbed up to see what was happening before chaos ensued, with shattered glass all over the yacht. And then we get another insight from Stephen Edwards. He captained the Bayesian for 5 years until 2020, so until fairly recently. And it was Edwards who suggested that Lynch's wife may have survived because of her tendency to be concerned, one could even say anxious, about safety on board, which led her to leave her cabin before the boat began its fatal rollover. Now, I'm not sure what's going on with the Telegraph. It seems they haven't gotten the memo. I've actually looked at another YouTube channel who was quoting, I think, Griffiths, and saying, I think what he meant to say was that the craft tipped over on its side, but that is not what he said. And so small little assumptions like that, if one note is false, it ruins the whole symphony. And I think a lot of that is taking place already at this early stage. It is not the position of the official investigation. Now, before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So, Mr. Edwards, Stephen Edwards, told the Telegraph that Ms. Baccares always wants to know what is happening and what the crew are doing. You kind of get the sense that she's, to some extent, hypervigilant, to some extent, restless, someone who's curious, kind of got an active mind. Edwards also said she's always the first person to come up to the bridge if she hears us scuttling about up there. That could explain why she was saved and Mike wasn't. But this also seems to explain something else. If Angela survived because she was more conscious of safety than Mike, her husband, then isn't that also why the one boat survived and the other didn't? Because one crew wasn't complacent and the other was. What do you call it when somebody hears something, wakes up and gets up and investigates, compared to somebody else who doesn't? Isn't that a degree of complacency? And you can even take it further than that. Even if the Bayesian crew were ambulant, but because they're on the Bayesian and the Bayesian was unsinkable, they're going to be more complacent, aren't they? And think about it, the other crew, didn't they act with more urgency and more consciousness of safety, just like Angela? Does that make sense? Stephen Edwards, the former captain who served on the Bayesian for 5 years, sketches a graphic portrait of what the victims went through in their final moments. This is quoting from the Telegraph. Mr. Edwards, who had spoken to former colleagues on the Bayesian that night, said that the sinking happened in just a few minutes once the yacht began taking on water, with the extreme tilt of the boat and broken furnishings making it extremely difficult for occupants to climb to safety from the lower cabins. He went on to say, those who stayed curled up in bed were in the worst situation. In other words, those who were complacent. adding that some of the guests also got up to see what was happening. I don't see anywhere in that a crew member coming down and navigating and assisting and guiding them. Anyway, he goes on to say, then the storm hit hard, placing them in the melee of flying furniture, glass and other items. He said some had made it to the saloon at this point, and they are the ones who survived, as their route outside would have been a little clearer. Now, although I do think the tilt became a factor, just as we saw on Titanic, in my opinion, it wasn't a tilt to the side, but one from horizontal to vertical. When I say my opinion, that's based on the facts as we know. It's not just my opinion sort of in a vacuum. It's based on what we know so far. And that's one side of it. I think the other side is that the darkness was also disorienting. I don't see Edward saying anything about that. And you kind of get the idea that the crew were on deck and they did no navigating in the darkness, whereas these poor unfortunate passengers had to do that, and that would have been really, really difficult. It is possible that in the darkness, the survivors, who were in a group of 5 all together, got lost. They couldn't find their way. Could a crew member have guided them out of the darkness? Going back to the article, inside the cabins, the only way to think of this is that people were lying in their beds one minute and the next the room was on its side, totally dark, with a door now either in the floor or in the ceiling above. Okay, so there he does mention the darkness. I must say, I don't really agree with that. You know, if it took 16 minutes, then I don't think it's 1 minute this, the next minute that. Although it could have been fairly rapid. 15 people survived, not because 1 second something was one way and the next. I just don't think it's as black and white as this. Anyway, he goes on to say, cabinets crashed open as the catches were weak, resulting in glassware and crockery falling out. I'm told almost all the furniture broke loose inside the boat. Well, that definitely would have made it kind of an obstacle course to get, on deck, to get out of these guest cabins. And someone actually described it as mice in a cage. Crew members who were on deck rescued passengers who were close at hand, but Mr. Edwards said that heading down towards the flooded lower parts of the yacht would have meant certain death. Now, it's interesting that you kind of get the idea that the crew members were on deck and they rescued passengers from the deck. No one went to the lower parts of the yacht. If the passengers could get themselves as far as they did in a group to crew quarters, and that's 5 of them, why couldn't the crew, any crew, help them the few more feet just to get out? It seems they needed guidance or navigation. Perhaps someone with a flashlight or phone could have done that. You just needed 1 crew member going down there and providing that kind of assistance. Anyway, this graphic gives you an exact location where the crew were found, obviously following an air bubble. I have to also say the 2 theory illustrations that I've seen from the Telegraph are so far the worst I think I've seen so far. That is not how I understand what happened. There was certainly no break to the mast. We should know this by now. And as far as I know, there was no collision with rocks or anything. So I really don't know what is going on with the people dealing with that. Edwards also seems to be solidly in the corner of the crew, saying that they are suffering from PTSD. But I have to say, on that, I've also read different reports of boozing and partying in the aftermath. Going back to the article, according to Mr. Edwards' account, the chief engineer, and that is Tim Parker-Eaton, was on his way to the bow in order to haul the anchor, which had come loose and was swinging around, when an extreme storm called a downburst drove the yacht onto its starboard side. I really don't agree with that either. It may have tilted the yacht to some extent, but it's almost as if they're saying it pushed the yacht on its side and then it sank. Because they go on to say, at an angle of more than 42 degrees, known as the flooding point, water pours into the vents that must be open so the engines and generators can operate. Mr. Edwards said he was 100% certain that the stern door was closed. I mean, how can he be 100% certain if he wasn't there? He goes on to say, I also suspect all the hatches were closed, but if they weren't, it was because the people were trying to escape through them. Edwards also believes mistakenly that the downburst drove the yacht onto its starboard side. One obvious question that arises is whether the chief engineer ought to have raised the anchor sooner. Could he have done it sooner? Should he have done it sooner? Because the other ship succeeded. But was that because the vessels were different in size, and so the other vessel's anchor was smaller, lighter, and easier to raise? Or did the other crewmate on the other ship act with greater alacrity? In effect, was the chief engineer of the BAYESIAN simply too slow to react? And then also the same applying to other crew members. Because one imagines if one has time after the tilting incident to get out of bed and go on deck, isn't there time to go and sort out the anchor? We've also seen that there's a woman who was able to rescue her baby. That kind of gives you a sense that, it wasn't so urgent that it was just unsurvivable, that there was no margin for error. I think there was a margin if you used your time effectively. Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.